Have you ever talked to people and they're like, man, I read 50 books this year, and you're thinking to yourself, 50 books? How in the world did you read 50 books? Well, in this video, I'm going to explain the secret to that. The secret is not read faster. The secret is not to read longer. The secret is actually to read shorter books. That's right. We're going to talk about some very short books in this video that I have found to be very powerful. You know, it's true. A book doesn't have to be long to be good. And it certainly doesn't have to be lengthy to be powerful and to change your life. There are a lot of books, a lot of really good books that are super, super short, yet nevertheless, they pack a tremendous punch to the heart, to the spirit, to the soul, things that edify, things that challenge, things that provoke. Man, there's a ton of really good books. And so what I'm going to do in this video, I'm going to set up a little tier chart for you. You know how we do this. We've done this before in a few different videos. We're going to set up a little tier chart here, and we're going to look at about 10 books I think I have for you that are super short, that will nevertheless fill your heart and challenge your soul. And here's my criteria for this particular video. A book has to be small enough that it can actually fit in your pocket. That's the criteria for this video. And not only that, but I'm going to be doing books that I've not talked about in other videos. Okay, so if you've already seen my 100 top books of all time list, I have a couple videos like that. I don't think any of these are on that list, so we're going to be covering some new ground in this video. If you're new to this channel, what's up, everybody? Before we get started, my name is Matthew. I'm one of the pastors here at Gospel Fellowship PCA. We are a Reformed, Bible-believing church just north of Pittsburgh. Also, adjunct professor at RPTS, the Reformed Presbyterian Theological Seminary. That being said, let's go ahead and get started with our tier chart. Now, the way I'm doing this tier chart is a little bit different from the way other people do tier charts. Usually good is on the top, bad is on the bottom. Nope, not going to roll like that today. In my tier chart, everything on this list is good. Okay, so we're working from fire, which is the awesome, super awesome, down to thumbs up, which is still very good in my book. So nothing is terrible. There is no bad in this particular chart. All right, so here, let's get rolling. Here are my qualifications and characteristics. In order to be a good, tiny little book, it has to be biblical, theological, devotional, something that builds the character, and something that has had life impact in my own personal life. One more thing before we get started, I just want to mention my new book is out, Worshiptainment, The Modern Church's Golden Calf. It is out. People are reading it. Some people have told me that they've read the entire book in one sitting because it is an easy to read book. If you're thinking of some of my other academic work, like my Edwards book on joy, or even Hold Fast the Faith on the Westminster Confession, this is the easiest book to read, but it's still very important on the regulative principle. We'll set that aside, and let's go ahead and get started with our first book here on my tier chart. On my regular row, thumbs up row, is Francis Schaeffer's The Mark of the Christian. Now, this is a tiny little book, really tiny. I'm not sure how many pages it is because it's been a while since I've read this book, but man, Francis Schaeffer, you know, I love everything that Francis Schaeffer does. And what Francis Schaeffer usually does, if you think about him, is he is something of a cultural apologist. Obviously, the Bible is his preoccupation, but within that window of applications, Francis Schaeffer is usually talking about cultural apologetics, defending the faith, especially by critiquing the creep of secularism and Marxism within the culture as he perceived it in his day. A lot of his books do that. He talks a lot about the reasonableness of Christianity, and of course, he is a presuppositional apologist. He is Presbyterian too. I like him for that. Also his cool little goatee. But in this tiny little book right here, The Mark of the Christian, he just challenges us and extols us to have love. Simple, faithful, biblical love. And the text, the main text for the book is John 13:35, a new commandment I give you, that you love one another just as I have loved you. And not only that, but in that verse, in John chapter 13, Jesus essentially gives the unbelieving world the right to critique us if we fail to have the kind of love that he gives to us. And if we who are his disciples fail to love in those ways, then the unbelieving world has every right to question the validity of our faith. And so in this tiny little book, Francis Schaeffer is calling us back to the hallmark, the mark of the Christian, which is, of course, love. Next, we're going to talk about this book, Chocolate Soldiers by C.T. Studd. Now, if you've never heard of C.T. Studd, he is one of the all-time great missionaries bringing the gospel to Africa. He was, in England, one of the world's most famous cricket players. And if you don't know what cricket is, it's that strange game to us Americans that looks something like baseball, but it's got weird pins, and they hit it with a strange-looking flat bat that looks like the tail of a platypus or something like that. All that notwithstanding, Chocolate Soldiers is a heart-melting challenge to global missions. And basically what C.T. Studd is doing here in this book is he's calling you a coward. I'm going to use this in my evangelism class for RPTS, I think, in the next quarter when I teach it again in the spring. But C.T. Studd, he says, where is your boldness? Where is your courage? Where is your audacity to bring the gospel to places that it is not? He says that most Christians today are like chocolate soldiers, and the implication there is that you melt under the real challenge, the real duress of actually carrying out what Jesus told us to do, which is to evangelize the world. You're going to find yourself convicted in this one. Still definitely worth the read. It'll probably only take you a few minutes to read this one. More of a tract, actually, but nevertheless, if you want to read something really thought-provoking from one of the world's most important global Christian missionaries, C.T. Studd's Chocolate Soldiers would be a good place to get going. Next, let me recommend something from my old professor, John Frame. Now, typically in my discussion of John Frame's writings, we've focused on his theology, particularly his systematic theology. We've talked before about his main book, Systematic Theology, thus the name. And when people ask me for recommendations, I often recommend his book, Salvation Belongs to the Lord, which is in some ways a truncated version of systematic theology, although it was actually written first. Frame is known for his triperspectivalism, which I've found to be a very helpful concept. I have done videos on that on this channel. But one thing that people forget is that Frame is not only a first-rate Reformed theologian, although, let's just be clear here, there are some areas that I think there's some things that could be critiqued, all right? But he's also a first-rate philosopher. And in this tiny little book, which can fit in your pocket, We Are All Philosophers, John Frame covers the most important questions in philosophy, but he does so from a Bible-believing Christian and even distinctly Reformed perspective. So questions such as, what is the meaning of life? Questions such as, what brings happiness, which is one of the philosophical preoccupational questions. Who is God? Is there a God? Is there an eternity? Things like that. John Frame takes up the main questions that philosophers have argued about, Aristotle, Socrates, Plato, and he answers them from a Christian perspective, I think in a very, very helpful and edifying way. So those two books are on my tier 2 ranking, my double thumbs up ranking. Let's move on to triple thumbs up. And let's go with this one right here, John Calvin, A Little Book on the Christian Life. Now, I just did a video a couple of weeks ago now, about why all the Calvin hates. And man, did that video, it did what I thought it was going to do. It polarized people. Some people love Calvin. Some people hate Calvin. Some people despise Calvin. Some people still have never read Calvin. And the people that have never read Calvin, of course, they're going to have a negative flavor about what they think of Calvin. All they've heard is memes and tropes and little historical anecdotes and things like that. I've challenged people again and again to actually read the Institutes of the Christian Religion. But who's going to do that? The volume is absolutely huge, right? But here we have a little book on the Christian life. And it is exactly what it says it is in the title. It is a little book on the Christian life. Here, John Calvin is his sweetest, his most pastoral, his most soul-filled writer, challenging, provoking, drawing Christians into a deeper relationship with Christ through obedience, faithfulness, trust, and confidence in the Lord. I think you're going to love A Little Book on the Christian Life by John Calvin. Again, so small, you could put it in your pocket. You could, if you started now, you could read this book before lunch, and you could say that you've been reading Calvin all morning, and I promise you'll be deeply edified in so doing. Next, let's throw a little Jonathan Edwards on the list. This is another little tractlet. It's hardly even fair to call it a book. You could definitely read this in a very short sitting. This is Jonathan Edwards' resolutions and his advice to young converts. Now, of course, we've talked about resolutions before on this channel. I have an entire book, Holy Living, Jonathan Edwards' 70 Resolutions for Living the Christian Life. But what I really want to talk about is not the resolutions, because I've done that before, but this other little thing that's very often appended to it, which is Edwards' advice to young converts. Now here, there's something very sweet that happened. during the revivals. There was a young woman, Deborah Hathaway by name, and she wrote Pastor Edwards a letter. And the letter was simply a very sweet request from a young girl, teenage girl, asking how it is that she could continue to grow in her faith as the revival continued to sweep through various cities within the colonies, various towns and countrysides. And Edwards writes back the most adorable, sweet, affirming, kind, and gracious letter. Here is Edwards at his pastoral best, writing from his desk in his office a sweet letter to a young teenage girl, challenging her to continue to follow after Christ in all faithfulness, honoring her elders and parents, and yet seeking to be obedient, despite whether or not her friends are going to follow after Christ. This is just a really helpful, applicable treatise, just a letter from a very wise pastor to a sweet young girl. I think that everybody who reads this book is certainly going to be benefited from it. So that's on my strong bicep level here. Now let's continue with another one. I'm going to do a video on this tomorrow. This is tomorrow's video, but Charles Spurgeon's A Defense of Calvinism also makes the list. Here's a book that you could probably read in under an hour, maybe a half an hour. I just read it on Kindle the other day. I just got it. Hold on my phone app for Kindle, and read it. Loved it. I've read it about 5 different times. It's a sweet little defense on why Charles Spurgeon is a Calvinist. He starts off writing very personally how he knows for a fact that he would not be saved if it wasn't for the grace and the mercies of Christ. And then he goes on to make a little bit more sophisticated arguments about Calvinism, distinguishing it from Arminianism. And then he also makes a few comments about hyper-Calvinism, which is a little bit more of a dangerous iteration of Calvinism, as it kind of reduces the free preaching and proclamation of the gospel. Anyways, we're going to talk about that tomorrow, so I'm going to let it go for now. But Charles Spurgeon's A Defense of Calvinism is a very good and helpful little book. Almost a tract. Certainly you could fit it in your pocket. Next. Okay, let me tell you one that you have not heard of before, probably, but this is a significant one. This one is called The Sum of Saving Knowledge. Now, this is another one of these great little books that's done by Crown and Covenant Publications right here in Pittsburgh. I bet you didn't know that for many, many years, every time somebody printed the Westminster Confession of Faith, this tiny little book, A Sum of Saving Knowledge, was also printed with it. That's right. This tiny little book has been printed alongside the Westminster Confession and Catechisms for ages. So what happened to it? Well, somewhere along the way, they stopped printing it with the confession. But let me tell you just a little bit about this. So this is a easy-to-read book. And in the year 1643, at the Solemn League and Covenant, of course, England, Ireland, and Scotland came together to covenant to agree to abide by the standards of the Westminster Assembly. And thus we have the history of the Catechism and the Confessions. I just did videos on that, so I'm not going to bore you with that. But when the Catechisms and Confessions came out, some pastors thought it might be helpful to have written up a brief little book, just in prose form, explaining the basic doctrine and systematic theology of the Catechism and language that anybody could read. And so David Dixon and who's the other guy? Let me see here. I'm blanking real quick. David Dixon and James Durham. That's right. 2 Scottish Covenanters got together, 2 professors. David Dixon, a much more senior professor, James Durham, a younger professor. They got together and they wrote a very, very easy to read, edifying book called, again, The Sum of Saving Knowledge, in which they explain how it is that a Christian is saved. And then they talk about how it is that we are obedient and faithful to the Lord in simple terms that practically anybody can understand. I love it because it's some of the best work of the Covenanters. Unfortunately, it's been lost to many people today. But check this out. When many of the Covenanters were martyred for their faith, very often when they were in the grass market about to be hanged or killed, however they were going to be executed, many of them testified to their faithfulness to Christ, and many of them said that this book was the book that led them to the Lord and or explained to them the doctrines of Christianity better than anything else. Interesting that they would name this book as one of the reasons why they stand for Christ even as they're about to be executed. So that's a very interesting book. So easy. You could read it in just a couple of sittings. Finally, I want to mention this. And I hope this isn't a Jesus juke for you, because every time I put the Bible or something like that at the top, people accuse me of it. But I want to mention again these handheld little psalters that Crown and Covenant has just recently put out as well. I've been talking about psalm singing, especially with my book Worshiptainment. I have a major chapter on worship and especially psalm singing. And speaking of something that you could carry around portably in your pockets, or take it with you to work, or bring it to your office, or on the mission trip, or whatever it is you're doing, these pocket psalters are perfect to take to the hospital to sing. If you are a psalm singer, or if you want to learn how to sing the psalms, you could probably do very little better than to get one of these pocket-sized psalters and take it everywhere you go. You can pray it, you can sing it. Beautiful, beautiful stuff there. All right, so there's my list. I'd love to hear if I missed anything. If there's any short, powerful books that should be on this list that aren't, please correct me in the comment section. Love to hear what you have to say about that. Well, that's it for me. Hope you benefited from this. I do love you lots, and we'll talk to you later.